Welcome to Stories from the Front. Take a second to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. The bridges of Arnhem hold secrets that few have survived to tell. George Bud Lewis is what they call me, and as a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne I saw Operation Market Garden turn our hopes of a Christmas at home into one of the darkest chapters of the war. That mission should have ended the conflict in 1944, but fate had other plans. I was only 22 when we boarded the C-47S in England that September morning. The weight of the equipment pulled me down beyond the parachute. We were carrying ammunition rations and medical equipment. My M1 Garand rifle was faithfully strapped to my side as always. In the aircraft, the silence was broken only by the roar of the engines and a few muttered prayers. Our mission had seemed simple in the briefing: jump over Holland, capture, and hold strategic bridges until the British ground forces arrived. The Arnhem Bridge was our main objective, the last bridge as we called it. It was the key to opening the way to the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. Sergeant Wilson, my best friend since basic training, sat next to me. He chewed his gum with characteristic calm, as if we were just going through another routine exercise. "It's going to be easy, Bud," he said, giving me a confident smile. Little did he know that it would be the last time I would see him alive. When the red light came on, my heart raced. The sound of anti-aircraft explosions began to shake the aircraft. "Ready," the command echoed, and we moved into position. The green light came on. Go, go, go. One after the other, we leapt into the Dutch sky. The moment of falling has always been surreal for me. For a few seconds, there is only the biting wind and a feeling of absolute freedom. But this time was different. The sky was full of parachutes with more than 35,000 men jumping simultaneously. It was a sight I'll never forget. We landed in open fields near Arnhem. The place seemed too quiet, which immediately alerted us. We quickly regrouped and started moving towards the city. It was then that we realized our first fatal mistake. The Germans were not as weakened in the region as our intelligence had indicated. The first few hours were relatively calm, and we managed to advance without much resistance. We set up defensive positions in houses and buildings near the bridge. The local population welcomed us as liberators, offering food and information about German movements. An elderly woman handed me a cup of hot coffee, a luxury I hadn't experienced for months. But the tranquility was short-lived. On the second day, all hell broke loose. SS Panzer divisions, which weren't supposed to be in the area, began to surround our positions. The noise of the approaching tanks was terrifying. Our anti-tank equipment was limited, and we soon realized that we were at a serious disadvantage. Wilson was leading a group defending a house 2 blocks from the bridge when the first mortars began to fall. I watched as he organized his men for a counterattack, but the German superiority was overwhelming. In a matter of minutes, the building he was in was hit by direct fire from a tank. There were no survivors. Our situation was getting worse by the hour. Communications with the command were precarious, and the promised reinforcements were not arriving. The constant sound of gunfire and explosions was mixed with shouts of order in German and English. The streets of Arnhem, once so peaceful, were now transformed into an urban battlefield. At night, the shelling continued, lighting up the sky with sinister flashes. We took shelter wherever we could, sharing the few rations we had left. Sleep was a luxury few could afford, always alert for the next attack. The faces of the young soldiers around me showed a mixture of fear and determination. In a moment of relative calm, I found a small diary in the pocket of my uniform. I began to write, perhaps sensing that I would need to remember those moments one day. "If anyone finds this," I wrote, "tell my family that we fought with honor." It was hard to keep my hands steady as I wrote, with the constant sound of artillery in the background. As the days passed, our situation became more and more desperate. Medical supplies ran out, and the wounded multiplied. Every man we lost was not just one less soldier, but a friend who would never come home. The bridge we were supposed to protect was there, so close, but it increasingly seemed like an impossible goal to maintain. At that moment, none of us knew that we were at the beginning of one of the most intense battles of the war in operation that would change not only the course of the conflict, but our lives forever. Operation Market Garden was just beginning, and Arnhem would become the scene of a desperate struggle for survival. The third day in Arnhem began with a massive German artillery attack. The city that was once a picture of Dutch beauty had turned into a hell of shattered concrete and twisted metal. Our defensive perimeter was shrinking by the hour, and the feeling of being in a mousetrap was growing along with the number of casualties. "Low ammo," shouted Private Parker from his position. Those words were becoming more frequent and terrifying. We distributed what was left, knowing that every shot had to count. My Garand only had 2 complete magazines, and I guarded them like gold. Our position was in a 3-story building overlooking the bridge. From the 2nd floor, I could watch the German movements through a partially destroyed window. The Nazis were moving methodically, house by house, street by street. Their tactic was clear: to slowly suffocate us. A young Dutch resistance man who introduced himself only as Jan managed to infiltrate our lines with crucial information. 2 SS Panzer divisions are approaching from the east, he whispered, his face covered in soot and sweat. And the Allied reinforcements are stuck in Nijmegen. That news was like a punch in the gut. That evening we held an impromptu meeting in the basement of our position. Lieutenant Adams, our commanding officer after the captain's death, was visibly exhausted. "Gentlemen, our situation is critical," he began, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "But every hour we hold this position is an hour more for our comrades to advance." Rationing became even more severe. We divided a can of rations between 3 men, and water had to be collected at night at the risk of enemy fire. I saw strong men crying from exhaustion, but no one talked about surrendering. The 101st Airborne was not known for giving up. One morning while checking our defensive line, I found a small group of civilians hiding in a basement. Among them was a little girl who reminded me of my younger sister. Her big, frightened eyes haunt me to this day. I shared some chocolate from my survival kit with them, and that child's smile was like a ray of light in the midst of chaos. The German attacks were becoming more coordinated and intense. They had learned our positions and patterns. Panther tanks advanced covered by infantry, while snipers kept us pinned down. We lost control of the northern end of the bridge, and our situation became more desperate by the minute. The sound of fighting was constant, a deadly symphony of explosions, machine gun bursts, and the characteristic noise of mortar shells cutting through the air. At night, the fires caused by the bombings lit up the city like giant ominous candles. One particularly violent afternoon, a concentrated attack hit our position. The building shook with direct hits, and the air became thick with dust and smoke. Parker was hit next to me, a piece of shrapnel passing through his shoulder. I dragged him behind a column while I applied an emergency bandage. "I don't want to die here, bud," he muttered, his face pale with pain and blood loss. "You're not going to die, you son of a bitch," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You still owe me those $20 for poker?" He managed to manage a weak smile before collapsing. The doctors were overwhelmed, treating the wounded in primitive conditions in the basements of the buildings. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the odor of gunpowder and death. Every time I visited the makeshift medical ward, I saw more familiar faces among the wounded. Our communication with the Allied command was sporadic. The radios only worked for a few hours a day when we could recharge the batteries. The messages we received were always the same: "Hold your positions. Reinforcements on the way." But the reinforcements never seemed to arrive. As the 4th day approached, the reality of our situation became clear. We were alone, surrounded by an enemy superior in numbers and equipment, with supplies running out and hopes dwindling. But still we kept fighting, not for glory or medals, but for each other and for the promise we had made never to abandon our post. The Arnhem Bridge, our main objective, stood there towering over the River Rhine like a silent witness to our sacrifice. Little did we know that those days would become part of one of the most controversial operations of the war, and that our actions, although seemingly futile at the time, would be remembered as an example of courage and determination in the face of the impossible. The 5th day in Arnhem brought a devastating change to our situation. Ammunition was practically exhausted, and the defensive perimeter had been reduced to just a few blocks around the bridge. Lieutenant Adams gathered the surviving officers for an emergency meeting in the basement of our main position. "We need to consider all the options," he said, his voice betraying the weight of the impossible decisions we were facing. The map in his hand, stained with blood and dust, showed our precarious situation. We were completely surrounded with the River Rhine at our backs. That same morning I tried to help evacuate some of the seriously wounded. Parker, still recovering from his shoulder injury, insisted on helping despite his condition. "I'm not going to stand by while you do all the work," he said, stubborn as ever. His determination was admirable, but I could see the pain in his eyes with every move. The Germans seemed to sense our weakness. The attacks intensified now with the support of flamethrowers. The smell of smoke and burning flesh mixed with the damp Dutch autumn air. In one of the buildings we met Jan again, now wounded but still determined to help. He had managed to map out the positions of the German snipers. "The tanks are moving to the west," Jan informed us, drawing quickly on the dusty ground. "They will attempt a coordinated attack at dawn." His information was valuable, but we had few resources to mount an effective defense. Throughout the night the shelling continued unabated. I took shelter in a basement with other soldiers, including young Miller, a recruit from Minnesota who had barely turned 19. He was shaking as he wrote a letter to his mother. "Do you think anyone will find this Sergeant Lewis?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Dawn brought with it the attack Jan had predicted. The Germans advanced with overwhelming force. Panther and Tiger tanks, supported by mechanized infantry, pressed our already weakened lines. Our resistance, though fierce, was reaching its limits. It was at this moment that I received the most devastating news: the Allied command had ordered our withdrawal. Operation Market Garden, our ambitious plan to end the war in 1944, had failed. The last bridge would be abandoned to the Germans. Lieutenant Adams organized the withdrawal in small groups, taking advantage of the night's cover. "Remember, men," he said, his voice firm despite his fatigue, "this is not a surrender. It's a tactical withdrawal." But we all knew what that meant. We had failed in our mission. The evacuation was a logistical nightmare. We had to move the wounded while maintaining a credible defensive line to deceive the Germans. Every meter we covered was a battle against time and the enemy. The sound of fighting echoed through the destroyed streets of Arnhem, a city that had become our own private hell. I saw men weeping silently as they helped carry their wounded comrades. Others prayed their prayers, mingling with the sound of distant explosions. The civilian population that had helped us would now face German occupation again. That thought weighed as heavily on our conscience as our own defeat. Jan decided to stay behind, saying that his place was with the Dutch resistance. Before we parted, he handed me his family watch. "So that you never forget Arnhem," he said with a sad smile. To this day I keep that watch as a reminder of those dark days. Our retreat continued into the early hours of the morning. We crossed the Rhine in small boats, always at risk of enemy fire. Every wave that hit the boat felt like a shot, keeping our nerves on edge. The fog that covered the river was our only protection against the watchful eyes of the Germans. As we pulled away, I took one last look at the Arnhem Bridge, its silhouette standing out against the dark sky. That sight would remain etched in my memory, forever the symbol of our failed mission, of our lost friends, of shattered dreams in the streets of a Dutch city. Operation Market Garden was over, but its cost in lives and impact on our souls would continue to haunt us for a long time. As we regrouped on the other side of the river, each of us carried not only the physical scars of battle, but also the weight of a defeat that would change the course of the war and our lives forever. Dawn on the 6th day after our retreat from Arnhem found us in a sorry state. We had regrouped in a small village south of the River Rhine, but the failure of the operation weighed on each of us like an invisible anchor. The losses were devastating, not just in numbers but in faces and names we knew well. Parker, still recovering from his injuries, spent hours looking north towards Arnhem. "We left a lot of people behind, Bud," he muttered over and over again. I knew he was thinking of Miller, who hadn't made it across the river with us. The young man from Minnesota had been shot during the evacuation, his body lost in the dark waters of the Rhine. The officers were trying to keep morale high, but it was an impossible task. Lieutenant Adams organized patrols and maintained a strict military routine, more to keep us busy than out of real necessity. "Stay alert," he would insist, "the Germans are still around." But we all knew that the real battle now was against our own demons. The news coming from higher command was discouraging. Operation Market Garden had been a complete failure. Our casualties were enormous, and the strategic objective of crossing the Rhine and penetrating Germany had proved unattainable. The road to Berlin we had been promised had turned into a bloody dead end. At night, the nightmares were constant. I relived those final moments in Arnhem over and over again, the screams of the wounded, the roar of the tanks, Jan's determined look when he decided to stay behind. His watch, which I still carried with me, seemed to weigh a ton in my pocket. One day, while we were organizing our remaining supplies, I found the diary I had started writing in during the siege. The pages were stained and crumpled, but the words were still legible. I reread my notes in despair, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. "The men are different," I wrote in a new entry. "It's not just physical fatigue, there's something deeper, a wound that won't heal. We lost more than a battle at Arnhem. We lost something inside ourselves." Lieutenant Adams gathered the surviving sergeants for an assessment of the situation. "We need to reorganize," he said, his voice betraying exhaustion. "The war isn't over, and we still have a job to do." But his words rang hollow in the ears of men who had seen their best friends die on a mission doomed to failure. The stories of the Dutch civilians who managed to escape from Arnhem began to reach us. They spoke of summary executions of captured resistance fighters, of a city turned into ruins. Each account was like a knife in our hearts, reminding us of the people we had promised to protect and failed. One afternoon, I received a letter from the command informing me that I was to be decorated for bravery in combat. The irony of the situation made me laugh bitterly. What value was a medal when so many good men had died? The cold medal and the piece of ribbon seemed like a mockery in the face of a sacrifice of Wilson Miller and so many others. The days dragged on in a monotonous routine of patrols, equipment maintenance, and waiting. The constant rain turned everything to mud, as if nature itself were weeping for our losses. The men gathered in small groups, sharing wet cigarettes and whispered stories about their lost comrades. Parker finally began to recover physically, but something in his eyes had changed permanently. "You know, Bud," he told me one night, "before Arnhem I still believed we were invincible, that nothing could stop us." Now his voice faded, leaving the unfinished sentence hanging in the damp air. The news from the Western Front kept coming. Other units, other battles, other victories and defeats. But for us Arnhem veterans, nothing seemed to matter so much anymore. We had seen the best and the worst of the war, and something fundamental had broken down in our understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. Jan's watch still ticked away the hours, a constant reminder of the passing time and the promises we couldn't keep. Sometimes late at night, I would hold it and think about the fate of that brave Dutchman and all the others we had left behind. The war continued, but a part of us had remained forever in Arnhem, along with our dreams of a quick and clean victory. The weeks that followed our withdrawal from Arnhem were a period of profound transformation. As we regrouped and received new recruits to fill the devastated ranks of our unit, I realized that there was something different about us bridge veterans. We were no longer the same confident young men who jumped that fateful September. The command tried to keep us busy with training and exercises, but the memories of Arnhem haunted us like restless ghosts. At night in camp, I could hear soldiers screaming in their sleep, reliving moments from the siege. Parker developed a nervous tick in his left eye that appeared whenever he heard the sound of artillery in the distance. Jan's watch became a kind of talisman for our unit. The men would ask to hold it for a few minutes, as if that object could connect them to something greater than our individual losses. "It's as if each tick represents a comrade we left behind," a young corporal told me one evening. We received sporadic news about the fate of Arnhem through messages from the Dutch resistance. The city had become a German stronghold, and the civilians who had helped us were facing harsh reprisals. Each piece of information was like a new wound opening up in our collective consciousness. Lieutenant Adams, always so strong, began to show signs of wear and tear. One afternoon, I found him alone, studying old maps of the operation. "Where did we go wrong, Lewis?" he asked, his voice laden with a sadness he had never shown before. Could we have done anything differently? There was no answer that could comfort that doubt. The new recruits looked at us with a mixture of admiration and fear. For them, we were the survivors of a legendary battle, but they didn't understand the weight we carried. They tried to make us tell heroic stories, but we knew that there was no real glory in that defeat, only sacrifice and loss. One morning while I was supervising the training of a group of recruits, one of them let slip a comment about how exciting it must have been to fight at Arnhem. Parker, who was standing nearby, exploded into a fury he had never shown before. Exciting? You want to know what's exciting, kid? It's watching your friends die one by one while you wait for reinforcements that never arrive. The impact of Operation Market Garden extended far beyond our personal experiences. The failure at Arnhem had changed the course of the war, prolonging the conflict and destroying hopes of a quick end. The generals and strategists debated the tactical errors, but those of us who were there knew that the true cost could not be measured on maps or reports. In my diary, I began to record not only the events but also the changes I observed in my companions. How Parker's easy smile had turned into a permanent expression of concern. How Lieutenant Adams spent hours alone, carrying the weight of impossible decisions. How each of us had developed our own rituals for dealing with memories. War changes us, I wrote one night, not just by what we live through, but by what we carry afterwards. Each Arnhem survivor is like a living bridge between two worlds, what we were before and what we become afterwards. The doctors began to notice a pattern among the Arnhem veterans. They called it combat fatigue, but it was something deeper. It was as if a part of our soul had been trapped in that Dutch town along with our fallen comrades. I received a letter from home asking when the war would be over. I couldn't answer. How could I explain that for us the war would never really end, that Arnhem would always be a battlefield in our minds where we would continue to fight every night in our nightmares? Winter was approaching, and with it came new mission orders. The war continued relentless in its march, but now we were facing not only the external enemy, but also our own inner demons. Each new day was a double battle against the Germans and against the memories that haunted us. 75 years have passed since Arnhem, but the memories remain as vivid as those days in September 1944. As I look at Jan's watch, now worn by time, but still working, I realize that surviving the war was only the beginning of a much longer battle. Parker never fully recovered. After the war, he settled in Iowa, but the shadows of Arnhem haunted him until his last day. I visited him regularly until his death in 1985. At our last meeting, he was still muttering about Miller and the Rhine River, his eyes lost in memories that only he could see. Lieutenant Adams had a different fate. He became a history professor, dedicating his life to teaching about the war, trying to ensure that the lessons of Arnhem were not forgotten. The real tragedy, he used to say, is not losing a battle, but forgetting what we fought for. I kept in touch with some Dutch survivors over the years. In 1969, I received a letter informing me that Jan had survived the war, continuing in the resistance until liberation. He never asked for his watch back, saying that it now belonged to the history we shared. The nightmares diminished over time, but they never disappeared completely. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the phantom sound of explosions and screams. My wife Catherine learned to recognize these moments, silently holding my hand until the mental storm passed. In 1994, I returned to Arnhem for the first time since the war for the 50th anniversary of the operation. The city was unrecognizable, rebuilt, and prosperous. But around every corner, I saw ghosts: Wilson organizing his defense, Parker carrying the wounded, Miller writing his last letter. At the memorial service, I met German veterans who had fought against us. They were old men now like me, carrying their own scars and regrets. One of them, Hans Schmidt, had commanded a panzer unit during the siege. We hugged and cried together, united by a shared understanding of the true cost of war. My war diary has become a historical document now, preserved in a museum in Arnhem. The yellowed pages tell a story of courage, sacrifice, and loss that transcends nationalities and generations. Young students read it today, trying to understand what it was like to be there, living through those terrible times. Operation Market Garden is studied in military academies as an example of miscalculated strategic ambition. But for those of us who were there, it represents something more profound, a testament to human endurance in the face of the impossible, to the camaraderie forged in the heat of battle. The years passed, and I saw many of my comrades leave. Each funeral was like reliving a piece of Arnhem, each farewell, taking with it another part of that living history. There are few of us now, the veterans of the last bridge, keepers of memories that will soon exist only in books and documents. Sometimes when I talk to young people about the war, I realize that Arnhem for them is just a name in a history book, a failed operation in a distant conflict. How can you explain the weight of each life lost, the sound of gunfire echoing in the narrow streets, the look in the eyes of a dying comrade? Jan's watch still ticks away the hours, a constant reminder that time marches on, but some memories remain frozen. Each tick seems to tell not just seconds, but stories of courage, of sacrifice, of humanity amid the chaos of war. In my later years, I realized that Arnhem's true legacy lies not in the battle itself, but in the lessons it taught us about human nature, about how ordinary people can show extraordinary courage in impossible circumstances, about how war reveals both the best and the worst in us. Now at 97, I am one of the last survivors of those days. I feel a responsibility to keep this story alive, not as a narrative of military glory, but as a testimony to the human cost of war and the importance of peace. Jan's clock will continue to mark time long after I am gone, carrying with it the stories of all those who fought, suffered, and died in Arnhem. May those who find it in the future remember not just the battle, but the men who gave everything for a better world. And so, as the shadows of dusk lengthen and time inexorably moves on, I realize that Arnhem was never just a lost battle. It was a lesson in the fragility of life, the power of comradeship, and the eternal price of war. A lesson that must be remembered and passed on so that future generations can understand the true meaning of sacrifice and hope.